On an ordinary morning at a luxury car dealership, Keanu Reeves, dressed simply in a worn leather jacket, stepped through the gleaming doors. Richard Carter, the arrogant manager, sized him up with disdain, dismissing him as someone unworthy of the showroom. Little did Richard know, the man he was belittling would teach him a lesson so profound, it would leave him drowning in regret. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll have another story just for you. The sun peeked over the skyline, bathing the city in a soft, golden hue. It was a calm morning, the kind that promised a regular, uneventful day, or so it seemed. Keanu Reeves, dressed in his usual understated style, stepped out of a small cafe he frequented. His black leather jacket had seen better days, and his faded jeans hinted at a man who valued comfort over luxury. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he walked through the bustling streets with an air of quiet confidence, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Keanu had a purpose that day, a search that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. He wanted to find something unique, a car that wasn't just a vehicle, but a piece of history. His idea wasn't born from a desire to indulge in extravagance but from a deep wish to use the car for a charitable cause. Perhaps a donation, or even an auction, where the proceeds could help those in need. The thought brought a faint smile to his lips as he sipped his coffee, savoring the moment. Across the city, the atmosphere inside a luxury car dealership was a stark contrast to the serene morning outside. The showroom sparkled with polished marble floors and gleaming cars that seemed more like museum exhibits than vehicles meant to be driven. Employees in tailored suits moved briskly, their voices low as they attended to a select clientele. Richard Carter, the dealership's manager, stood at the center of it all. His sharp suit and meticulously styled hair projected authority, but his demeanor carried an air of superiority. Richard prided himself on running an exclusive establishment, catering to those who could afford the most extravagant luxuries. He had little patience for anyone who didn't fit his idea of worthy customers. As Keanu approached the dealership, he paused for a moment outside, studying the pristine glass facade. His reflection stared back at him, a stark contrast to the polished, high-end world beyond the doors. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, his boots making a muted thud against the plush carpet. Richard, who had been scanning the showroom, immediately noticed the newcomer. His eyes swept over Keanu, taking in the worn leather jacket, the casual jeans, and the understated demeanor. In an instant, Richard's expression shifted to one of subtle disdain. To him, Keanu was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world of exclusivity and wealth. Keanu walked further into the showroom, his gaze sweeping over the cars on display. His calm, focused demeanor didn't waver, even as he felt the weight of Richard's scrutinizing eyes. Finally, his attention was drawn to a car tucked away in a corner, a vintage model that seemed to exude character and history. Before he could take another step toward it, Richard intercepted him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with skepticism. "Yes," Keanu replied, his voice calm. "I'm interested in learning more about that car over there." Richard hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's one of our most exclusive models," he said, emphasizing the word exclusive. Keanu nodded. "It's exactly what I'm looking for," he said simply. Richard's smile tightened. "I see," he said, his tone now carrying a hint of condescension. "Well, let me see if I can find someone to assist you." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Keanu standing alone. Keanu sighed quietly but didn't let the interaction deter him. He stepped closer to the car, admiring its smooth lines and immaculate finish. As he ran his hand along the side, he could feel the whispers and glances directed at him from the staff. But he chose to focus on the car, letting their judgment slide off him like water off a stone. Keanu stood by the car, his fingers lightly grazing its glossy surface as he admired the craftsmanship. The soft murmur of voices behind him wasn't lost on him, though he chose not to react. He had encountered such moments before, judgmental stares, whispered comments, but he had always believed actions spoke louder than words. Across the showroom, Richard Carter had joined a group of employees near the reception desk. They watched Keanu with varying degrees of curiosity and amusement, their voices low but not quite low enough to escape his ears. "Do you think he even knows how much that car costs?" one of them muttered. Richard smirked. "Doubt it. He doesn't exactly look like our usual clientele, does he?" Another employee chuckled. "Maybe he's just here to take some pictures for his social media. You know how people like to pretend they belong." The words stung, but Keanu remained outwardly calm, his focus still on the car. He walked around it slowly, examining every detail, from the curve of its fenders to the intricate design of its wheels. This was more than just a car to him, it was a symbol of something larger, a tool to make a difference. Richard, emboldened by the laughs of his colleagues, decided to approach again. He adjusted his tie and strode over with a self-assured air. "Enjoying the view?" he asked, his tone teetering on sarcasm. Keanu turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "It's a beautiful car," he said simply. "It is," Richard agreed, his smile thin. "One of our finest models. Rare, exclusive, and quite expensive." He emphasized the last word, his eyes scanning Keanu's attire as though it confirmed his suspicions. Keanu met his gaze without flinching. "I'd like to know more about it. Can you tell me its history?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. For a moment, he considered brushing Keanu off again, but something about the man's calm demeanor unsettled him. "Of course," he said, recovering quickly. "But, as I'm sure you understand, vehicles like this attract a certain type of buyer." "And what type is that?" Keanu asked, his voice steady. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People who understand the value of what they're looking at. People who can appreciate the craftsmanship, and afford it." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as though considering the statement. "Understanding value isn't about money," he said after a pause. "It's about seeing the potential in something and knowing what it can represent." The words caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he faltered, unsure how to respond. Then, as if doubling down on his initial judgment, he crossed his arms. "I see," he said, his tone growing colder. "Well, I'll let you continue browsing. If you need assistance, feel free to let someone know." He turned and walked away before Keanu could say anything further. The whispers resumed almost immediately, louder this time. "Did you see the way he talked back to Richard?" one employee said. "Does he even know where he is?" another chimed in. Keanu, still standing by the car, heard every word. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, masking the faint trace of discomfort that threatened to surface. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. What mattered now was how he chose to handle it. As he continued studying the car, an idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps this wasn't just about buying a car. Perhaps this was an opportunity to teach someone a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The tension in the showroom was almost palpable, a subtle yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Keanu Reeves, standing by the vintage car that had captured his attention, remained calm and composed, but he could feel the weight of the judgmental stares directed his way. The whispers among the staff had grown louder, no longer bothering to mask their disdain or amusement. Richard Carter, the manager, watched from a distance, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Internally, however, he felt a simmering frustration. He couldn't understand why this man, dressed so plainly and clearly out of place, insisted on lingering around a car he likely couldn't afford. It wasn't just the potential waste of time that irked him, it was the defiance in Keanu's calm demeanor, as though he refused to acknowledge the unspoken rules of this exclusive world. Richard walked over to the receptionist, a young woman named Grace who was nervously shuffling papers. "Grace," he said, lowering his voice, keep an eye on him. I don't want him touching that car anymore. We can't have him scratching the paint or something." Grace glanced at Keanu, who was now examining the car's interior through the window, and hesitated. "But, sir," she began cautiously, "he hasn't done anything wrong." Richard's eyes narrowed. "That's not the point. Just do as I say," he snapped, before turning back toward the center of the showroom. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to observe the car, paying little attention to the murmurs around him. He noticed every detail: the curvature of the body, the meticulous design of the wheels, the way the light reflected off its polished surface. It was everything he had been looking for, a car with history, character, and purpose. As he circled the vehicle, a younger salesman named Tom approached cautiously. Unlike Richard, Tom was new to the dealership and hadn't yet adopted the same air of superiority. Though nervous, he couldn't help but feel curious about the man who had captured everyone's attention. "Excuse me, sir," Tom said hesitantly, "can I help you with anything? Are you interested in this car?" Keanu turned and offered a small, genuine smile. "I am. It's a beautiful piece of work," he said, gesturing toward the car. "Do you know much about it?" Tom nodded quickly, eager to share what he knew. "Yes, actually. This is a 1968 model, fully restored. The engine has been upgraded, but the exterior and interior have been kept as original as possible. It's one of the rarest cars we have here." Keanu listened intently, nodding along as Tom spoke. He appreciated the young man's enthusiasm and willingness to help, a stark contrast to the hostility he'd faced so far. From across the room, Richard noticed the interaction and frowned. Without hesitation, he strode over, his footsteps firm and deliberate. "Tom," he said sharply, cutting the conversation short, "I'll handle this." Tom stepped back, his expression uncertain, as Richard turned his attention to Keanu. "Still admiring the car, I see," Richard said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Keanu met his gaze calmly. "It's an impressive vehicle," he replied. "I was just learning more about it from your colleague." Richard forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, as I mentioned earlier, this car is very exclusive. It's not something just anyone can buy." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering Richard's words. "I understand that," he said evenly. "But I'd still like to know more about it. For example, has it been driven much since the restoration?" Richard blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, he faltered, but his condescension quickly returned. "Not much at all," he said dismissively. "But, as I'm sure you can imagine, the cost reflects its rarity." "Of course," Keanu said simply, his calm demeanor unshaken. The exchange seemed to irritate Richard further. He straightened his posture, his voice growing colder. "Look," he said, "I don't want to waste your time, or mine. Cars like this aren't for everyone. Perhaps you'd like to take a look at some of our other models, ones that might be more suitable." Keanu regarded Richard for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a faint click caught both of their attention. Standing near the edge of the showroom was a young man with a phone in his hand, the camera lens pointed discreetly in their direction. The faint click of the camera phone was like a spark in the tension-filled showroom. Keanu Reeves turned slightly, his eyes meeting those of the young man holding the phone. The man quickly looked away, pretending to examine a nearby car, but it was clear he had been recording the interaction. Keanu gave no visible reaction and returned his focus to Richard Carter, the dealership manager, who seemed oblivious to the quiet act of observation. Richard, however, was growing increasingly agitated. Keanu's calm, unwavering demeanor, coupled with his refusal to back down, had thrown him off balance. He wasn't used to being challenged in his own domain, least of all by someone he deemed unworthy of his time. "Mr. Richard began, his tone now sharper, I think we've made ourselves clear. This car is not something just anyone can afford. Perhaps it's better to explore more realistic options." Keanu's expression remained neutral, though a subtle flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, passed across his face. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly, "but I don't think you're in a position to determine what's realistic for me." Richard's jaw tightened, his forced smile fading. "With all due respect," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this dealership serves a particular clientele. We have a reputation to uphold, and frankly, I'm not convinced you're the kind of customer we're looking for." A murmur rippled through the showroom. Several employees paused their tasks to watch the unfolding confrontation, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some customers glanced over as well, pretending not to listen while clearly tuning into every word. Keanu remained calm, his gaze steady. "And what kind of customer is that?" he asked, his tone still polite but with an edge that hinted at deeper frustration. Richard hesitated, but only for a moment. "Someone who understands the value of what we offer here. Someone who appreciates luxury, exclusivity, and," he gestured vaguely at Keanu's attire, "fits the profile." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering Richard's words. "That's an interesting perspective," he said finally. "But it seems to me that you're confusing luxury with arrogance." The quiet, measured statement landed like a thunderclap. Several employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, and the young man with the phone subtly shifted to capture more of the scene. Richard's face darkened. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rising slightly. Keanu didn't raise his voice, but there was a new intensity in his tone. "You seem to believe that someone's worth is tied to their appearance, their clothes, or their ability to flaunt wealth. But true value, the kind that matters, has nothing to do with any of that." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, louder this time. Richard's composure was visibly cracking. "Look," he said, his voice now tense with barely concealed anger, "I've been patient, but I won't stand here and be lectured in my own showroom. If you're not here to buy, I suggest you leave." Keanu took a small step closer, closing the gap between them. Though his expression remained calm, there was an unmistakable strength in his gaze. "And if I am here to buy?" he asked quietly. Richard faltered, the question throwing him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed to truly look at Keanu, not just his clothes or his demeanor, but the quiet confidence that radiated from him. Before Richard could recover, another voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me," the young man with the phone said, stepping forward hesitantly. All eyes turned to him, and he looked nervous but determined. "I think you might want to rethink how you're treating him." Richard whirled on the man, his irritation now fully unleashed. "And who exactly do you think you are?" he snapped. The man hesitated, glancing at Keanu before speaking again. "Someone who knows respect when I see it," he said. "And someone who knows when it's missing." The words struck a chord in the room. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the faint hum of the showroom's air conditioning. Keanu, for his part, remained composed, his gaze fixed on Richard as though waiting for his next move. Richard, however, seemed to have lost whatever control he'd managed to maintain. His face flushed with anger, and he took a step closer to Keanu. "You don't get to come in here and—" But before he could finish, Keanu raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His voice was calm but firm. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about you, and the choices you're making right now." The simplicity of the statement seemed to deflate Richard. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue further, but then he glanced around the room, taking in the stares of his employees and the customers who had stopped pretending not to listen. Keanu let the silence stretch for a moment before stepping back. "Thank you for your time," he said simply. Then, with a nod to the young man who had spoken up, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the room in stunned silence. The glass doors of the showroom swung shut behind Keanu Reeves, but the tension he left behind lingered heavily in the air. Richard Carter stood frozen, his face flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. The murmurs from the employees had ceased, replaced by a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped turning inside the dealership. Richard's pride was bruised, not only because of Keanu's calm but cutting words but also because of the young man who had dared to challenge him in front of everyone. His fists clenched at his sides as he spun toward the employees, who were now exchanging wide-eyed glances. "What are you all staring at?" Richard barked, his voice echoing in the now quiet space. "Get back to work." The staff scattered, heads down, but their whispered conversations resumed almost immediately. They couldn't stop talking about what had just happened, Keanu's composure, Richard's meltdown, and the mysterious young man who had captured it all on his phone. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, Keanu stood by the sidewalk, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. He wasn't angry, but there was a heaviness in his expression, a quiet disappointment that wasn't aimed at Richard alone but at the larger issue of prejudice and judgment that the encounter had laid bare. The young man who had spoken up earlier stepped out of the dealership, his phone still clutched in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then approached Keanu. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tentative. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened in there. That was unfair." Keanu turned to him, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to apologize," he said. "It's not your fault." The young man hesitated again, then held up his phone. "I recorded what happened. I hope that's okay. I just thought people should see it." Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you think it'll make a difference, do what you feel is right," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his words that suggested he understood the power of the moment. The young man nodded, his determination growing. "Thank you," he said simply, before walking away. Back inside the dealership, Richard was pacing the floor, his frustration mounting with every step. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over, that the events of the morning would come back to haunt him. His instincts were right. Hours later, the video of the encounter was uploaded to social media. Within minutes, it began gaining traction. The clip showed everything: Richard's condescending remarks, Keanu's calm but pointed responses, and the young man's brave interjection. The title of the video was simple but damning: "When Arrogance Meets Humility, Keanu Reeves Teaches a Lesson." As the video spread, the comments came pouring in. "How can anyone treat Keanu like that? He's literally the kindest man in Hollywood. This manager should be ashamed. What kind of customer service is this? Keanu handled this with so much grace. A true legend." By evening, the video had gone viral, with millions of views and shares across platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and hashtags like #RespectIsLuxury and #LearnFromKeanu began trending worldwide. Inside the dealership, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Phones rang incessantly with angry callers demanding an explanation. The company's social media pages were flooded with criticism, and employees whispered about the fallout they feared was coming. Richard, seated in his office, stared at his computer screen, watching the video play out for what felt like the 100th time. The weight of his actions was sinking in, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it, at least, not yet. By the next morning, the fallout from the viral video was in full force. The once bustling dealership was eerily quiet. Customers who had scheduled appointments called to cancel, citing the video as their reason. Social media was ablaze with outrage, with countless users calling for boycotts and demanding accountability from the dealership. The hashtags #RespectIsLuxury and #LearnFromKeanu dominated the conversation, while memes of Richard's dismissive remarks circulated widely. Richard Carter sat in his office, his head in his hands, staring at the email inbox on his computer. It was flooded with complaints and questions from both the dealership's corporate office and furious customers. The subject lines alone were enough to make his stomach churn. Urgent, explanation needed regarding viral video. Complaint, manager's behavior is unacceptable. Accountability for discrimination. He closed his laptop with a sharp sigh, leaning back in his chair. He had spent years building his reputation as a top-tier manager, but now it was unraveling before his eyes. His phone buzzed on the desk beside him, the screen lighting up with another incoming call. It was the regional director. Richard hesitated before letting it go to voicemail. He couldn't face the repercussions, not yet. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, reporters and curious onlookers had begun gathering, eager for any updates. The young man who had recorded the video was also being hailed as a hero online. In interviews, he described what he witnessed, emphasizing Keanu's composure and the importance of treating everyone with respect. As the pressure mounted, employees at the dealership began speaking out anonymously to the media. "This isn't the first time Richard's treated someone this way," one employee admitted in an online forum. "He's always been condescending to people he thinks don't belong." Another employee shared similar sentiments. "The way he judged that man based on his appearance, it wasn't surprising. That's just how he operates." These revelations only added fuel to the fire. The dealership's corporate headquarters released a statement condemning the behavior seen in the video and promising a thorough investigation. But for many, it was too little, too late. The damage to the brand's reputation had already been done. Amid the chaos, Keanu remained silent. He hadn't made any public statements about the incident, choosing instead to let the video speak for itself. Despite the media frenzy surrounding him, he continued with his daily routine, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. Back at the dealership, Richard's breaking point finally arrived. The regional director had left him multiple voicemails, each one more urgent than the last. When he finally returned the call, the conversation was brief but devastating. "Richard," the director said, his tone clipped, "we've received countless complaints about your behavior, and the video has done irreparable damage to our image. Corporate has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you out within the hour." Richard's heart sank. He opened his mouth to protest, but the director didn't give him a chance. "This is non-negotiable," he said. "You've put the entire company at risk, and we can't afford to keep you on. Goodbye." The line went dead. Richard sat motionless for a moment, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He had always believed himself untouchable, but now, his arrogance and prejudice had cost him everything. As he packed his belongings into a small box, he couldn't escape the whispers of the employees who had once feared him. Their hushed tones and sideways glances were filled with a mix of vindication and pity. By the time he stepped out of the dealership, his career in tatters, the crowd outside had grown. Cameras clicked, and reporters shouted questions, but Richard kept his head down, avoiding their gaze as he walked to his car. For the first time in years, he felt truly small. Richard Carter sat in his small apartment, staring blankly at the television screen. The news anchor's voice echoed through the room, recounting the story of the viral video that had destroyed his career. His face, once a symbol of authority and success within the dealership, was now plastered across every major network and social media platform. The headlines were unforgiving. Luxury car manager's arrogance exposed in viral video. Keanu Reeves teaches a lesson in humility. When judgment costs more than respect. Richard muted the television, unable to bear the sound of his name being mentioned again. The humiliation was suffocating. For years, he had built his career on projecting an image of control and superiority, but now, that carefully crafted persona had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but regret. The fallout had been swift and brutal. After his termination, corporate representatives visited the dealership to address the growing public outrage. Employees were interviewed, and it didn't take long for Richard's history of condescending behavior to come to light. Former colleagues recounted numerous instances where he had dismissed or belittled customers who didn't fit his idea of suitable clientele. The dealership itself was struggling to recover. Once a thriving business catering to the city's elite, it now faced boycotts and plummeting sales. High-profile clients canceled orders, citing the viral video as their reason. The company's reputation, painstakingly built over decades, was in tatters. For Richard, the consequences extended far beyond his professional life. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the man at the center of such a public scandal. Even his family, though supportive, couldn't hide their disappointment. He spent hours replaying the events in his mind, haunted by the memory of Keanu Reeves standing calmly before him, unshaken by his arrogance. The actor's words echoed in his head like a relentless mantra: "You seem to believe that someone's worth is tied to their appearance, but true value has nothing to do with that." Those words cut deeper now than they had in the moment. At the time, Richard had dismissed them as sanctimonious, but in the quiet solitude of his apartment, he couldn't deny their truth. He had spent so much of his life judging others, never stopping to consider the harm he might be causing. Desperate to escape his own thoughts, Richard turned to his laptop and opened the dealership's website. It was flooded with negative reviews and comments, each one more scathing than the last. Among the sea of criticism, one comment stood out. "Respect is the one luxury anyone can afford to give, but it seems harder to find than any car in that showroom." The words stung because they mirrored Keanu's parting remark. They were a stark reminder of the lesson Richard had failed to learn until it was too late. Unable to sleep, Richard began searching for information about Keanu Reeves. He had known of the actor before the incident, of course, but only in passing. Now, he read story after story about Keanu's generosity and humility, buying motorcycles for stunt teams, quietly donating to charities, and treating everyone with the same level of respect, regardless of their status. The contrast between Keanu's actions and his own behavior was glaring. Richard couldn't ignore the reality any longer. His arrogance had blinded him, not only to others' worth but also to his own potential for growth. For the first time in years, Richard felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: shame, not just for what had happened, but for the kind of person he had become. As dawn broke, Richard stared out of his window, the city below beginning to stir. He knew there was no undoing the damage he had caused, but he also realized he had a choice: to wallow in regret or to take responsibility for his actions and try to make amends. The thought terrified him, but it also sparked a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to change. While the storm of media attention and public backlash raged on, Keanu Reeves quietly went about his life. Unlike the dealership and its former manager, who were scrambling to mitigate the damage, Keanu saw the situation as an opportunity, not for retribution, but for change. Sitting in his modest home, he watched the viral video once. The interactions, the dismissive tone of Richard, and his own responses played out on the screen. But Keanu wasn't focused on the criticism directed at the dealership or the praise he was receiving. What lingered in his mind was the deeper issue the video had exposed: the tendency to judge people based on their appearance, status, or wealth. He picked up his phone and called a close friend, Sam, who worked with him on various charitable initiatives. "Sam," Keanu said, his voice calm but resolute, "I think we can do something meaningful with this." "What are you thinking?" Sam asked, intrigued. "This video has everyone talking about respect and judgment," Keanu explained. "Let's use this moment to promote something bigger, a movement that encourages people to treat others with dignity, no matter their background." The two brainstormed for hours, eventually deciding on a campaign called "Respect is Luxury." The campaign's goal was to highlight stories of kindness, inclusion, and respect from everyday people, showing that true value lies in how we treat one another, not in material possessions. Keanu knew he wanted to start with the car that had been at the center of the incident. While he had refused to purchase it from the dealership, he found a similar vintage model at a smaller, family-owned lot. When Keanu arrived to finalize the purchase, the owner, Mark Spencer, greeted him with genuine warmth and respect. "Welcome," Mark said, extending a hand. "How can I help you today?" Keanu smiled. "I'm looking for something special, and I think I've found it," he replied. Mark treated Keanu like any other customer, asking about his needs and walking him through the car's history. The interaction was simple, honest, and free of judgment, a stark contrast to what Keanu had experienced before. After purchasing the car, Keanu posted a photo on social media with Mark and his team, along with a caption that quickly went viral: "True luxury is being treated with respect. Thank you for reminding me of that." The post resonated deeply with people around the world. Thousands shared their own experiences of being judged or dismissed, and the hashtag #RespectIsLuxury took on a life of its own. Celebrities, influencers, and even major brands joined the conversation, using the moment to reflect on their own values and practices. Keanu took the restored car and organized a charity auction, with all proceeds going toward organizations promoting equality, education, and social inclusion. The event attracted significant attention, with attendees including other high-profile figures who were inspired by Keanu's approach to turning a negative experience into a force for good. During the auction, Keanu delivered a short but powerful speech. "This car was just an object," he began, his voice steady. "But it became a symbol of something more, a reminder that respect costs nothing but means everything. It's not about who you are, what you wear, or what you own. It's about how we choose to treat one another. That's the true measure of worth." The audience erupted in applause, not just for the message, but for the humility and grace with which Keanu had handled the entire situation. As the campaign gained momentum, it sparked a broader movement. Businesses re-evaluated their customer service policies, emphasizing inclusivity and respect. Schools adopted the campaign's message into their curricula, teaching students the importance of kindness and empathy. And as for the dealership where it all began, its reputation remained tarnished. Despite corporate restructuring and public apologies, it struggled to recover. Richard, now out of a job, watched from the sidelines as the world rallied around the message he had once dismissed. In the end, the incident wasn't remembered for the arrogance it revealed but for the change it inspired. Keanu Reeves had turned a moment of judgment and disrespect into a powerful lesson, proving once again that humility and kindness have the power to transform the world. Thank you for watching this story of humility and transformation. If it inspired you, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Join us tomorrow for another tale that will touch your heart and spark reflection.